Okay, today we're going to dive into a really tough but absolutely crucial part of World War II history. It's a side of the story that really complicates the narrative we all think we know about the Holocaust by looking at the shocking and widespread collaboration that happened all across Europe.
So let me ask you something right off the bat. When you think about the Holocaust, who do you picture as being responsible? I bet for most of us, the answer that immediately pops into our heads is Nazi Germany. But what if that's not the whole story? Not even close.
The thing is, the real story, it's just so much bigger and honestly a lot more uncomfortable than we're often taught. The responsibility spreads far wider and it's way more complex, pulling in collaborators and participants from all over the continent. And that's where we get to this idea of a hidden Holocaust. We're going to peel back the layers on this myth that Nazi Germany acted all on its own, and instead uncover this tangled web of complicity that stretched across an entire continent. We're moving on to look at the different non-German groups and nations that were actively working with the Nazis, creating what was basically a multinational force.
And wow, when you look at who these collaborators were, it's an incredibly diverse group.
And this collaboration, it went way beyond just the German military. We're talking about entire nations allied with the Axis, and literally thousands of individual volunteers from all across the continent. You had Muslim volunteers from the Balkans, recruited by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. You had fascist volunteers from all over Europe who couldn't wait to join Operation Barbarossa, that huge invasion of the Soviet Union. And then you had formal state allies, like Croatia's super brutal Ustash regime, Mussolini's Italy, and even Franco's Spain. This quote here is from Leon de Grelle, a Belgian Nazi collaborator. He was boasting about this pan-European fascist movement. To him, this wasn't just a German project. He saw it as a European one. It's a really chilling look from inside the machine. He even talked about how Hitler gave Muslim volunteers these pendants with a tiny Quran inside. For him, this was some kind of great European crusade. And that just highlights a crucial point. The Nazi project had a very specific enemy. Any European of any religion was welcome, with that one single exception. We're not talking about a few bad apples or isolated incidents here. The claim is that pretty much every single country that was touched by Nazi influence was involved in some way, shape, or form. Now, it's super important to understand that this collaboration wasn't some one-size-fits-all deal. It really existed on a spectrum. You had different countries playing vastly different roles in helping the Nazis carry out their horrific crimes. I mean, just look at the different forms this took. In France, for instance, you had collaborationist forces that were actively rounding up and deporting their own Jewish citizens. Then you have Croatia, where the fascist Ustaše regime didn't just help the Nazis, they created their own extermination plans. Toward the end of the war, Mussolini's puppet state, the Slow Republic in Italy, also deported Jews. And even in a place like fascist Spain, which was officially neutral, you still had a Gestapo network operating and thousands of volunteers sent to fight for Hitler. And, well, just listen to this quote. It's absolutely chilling. It says that Jewish survivors remembered local collaborators, specifically from Lithuania and Ukraine, for being so cruel that they sometimes surpass the brutality of the German Nazis. That just tells you how ferocious this collaboration was on the ground. But here's where it gets even more twisted, a really disturbing paradox. The very same people that the Nazis labeled as subhuman, Slavic peoples like Lithuanians and Ukrainians, who were themselves destined for slavery or death under Nazi ideology, were in some cases among their most vicious and enthusiastic collaborators. This whole history is just full of these contradictions, and maybe no case is more complicated or more paradoxical than Poland. Here you have a nation that was, without a doubt, a primary victim of the Nazis, but it was also a place where significant collaboration occurred. So you've got these two completely different stories, right? On one hand, you have the absolute undeniable truth of Poland's immense suffering. Millions of its citizens, both Jewish and non-Jewish, were murdered by the Nazis. But then there's this other side, a buried history of Poles voluntarily participating in those same crimes. And look, the story that we've all learned in history class, it's completely true. When you think about the start of World War II, your mind immediately goes to Poland, right? The first country invaded, the primary victim of Nazi Germany's aggression. The invasion, the brutal occupation, the incredible suffering, all of that is the bedrock of how we understand Poland's story, and it's an accurate one. I mean, the sheer scale of the suffering it's just hard to wrap your head around. We're talking about more than 5 million Polish citizens. 5 million. And that number includes over 3 million Polish Jews, all murdered by the German regime. This isn't just a statistic. It's a core, undeniable fact of the Holocaust and the war itself. But what if that's not the whole story? What if I told you that this narrative, this true narrative of victimhood, isn't the complete picture? That there's another layer to it, a much more complicated and, frankly, disturbing layer that was intentionally buried for decades. And that's where we get to this incredible turning point, this moment of, well, historical reckoning. It's called the Jedwabne Revelation. And it all kicked off because of a single book, a book that basically shattered a country's story about itself.
So, let's travel back in time. The date is July 10th, 1941. The place? A small Polish town called Jedwabne, under German occupation. And on this day, something truly awful happens. A pogrom, a violent, organized massacre, is unleashed against the Jewish people living in the town.
Now, for 60 years, everyone believed they knew who did it. The official story was simple. The Germans were responsible. But then, in 2001, a historian named Jan T. Gross comes out with this book, Neighbors, and it just blows the lid off everything. He documented what really happened that day. Gross's research laid out the terrible final act of this pogrom. The town's Jewish community, we're talking about some 1,600 people, men, women, and even children, they were herded into a barn and burned alive. So the what was known, the horror of it was known. But the who? That was the explosive part. And here is the absolute gut punch. The assumption for decades was that the occupying German forces did this. But the reality, the truth that Gross uncovered, the murderers weren't German soldiers. They were their own neighbors, non-Jewish Poles. Can you imagine? This didn't just cause a stir. It sent an earthquake through Poland and, honestly, the entire world.
Okay, so Jedwabne was the bombshell. But the big question was this a one-off, a terrible, isolated incident, or was it a symptom of something much, much bigger? And yeah, as other researchers started digging, they found out it was part of a much wider, more devastating pattern.
This brings us to another really important historian, Jan Grabowski. He saw the questions that Jedwabne raised and took it to the next level. He spent years deep in the archives trying to answer one crucial question. What happened to the Jews who managed to escape the ghettos and went into hiding? And his findings are just staggering. He estimated that more than 200,000 Jews, think about that, 200,000 people who had escaped the ghettos, who had a chance, were ultimately murdered, not by the Germans, but either directly by or because they were turned in by their fellow Polish citizens. So you have to ask, how does something like this even happen? And it's not one simple answer. The research shows it was a bunch of things. You had some Poles who were actually sympathetic to Nazi ideas. You had others who just willingly and actively helped out. You even had Polish police forces involved in what was called the Hunt for the Jews. And in some cases, local clergy and politicians basically gave it their blessing. Why would people do this? Well, the motivations were a really toxic mix. First, there was this deep-seated historical anti-Semitism that was already there. But there was also just raw greed, people wanting to seize Jewish homes and property. And on top of all that, the Germans were offering rewards for turning in Jews, creating this absolutely monstrous incentive system. And maybe nothing shows the deep-seated anti-Semitism that fueled all of this more than what happened after the war was officially over. We need to talk about a truly horrific event called the Kielce pogrom. First, just so we're all on the same page, a pogrom is basically a violent riot, a mob-led massacre. Historically, the term has been used for attacks aimed at Jewish communities, and it carries a long, brutal history with it. Okay, just look at this timeline. The war in Europe is over in May 1945. More than a year later, in July of 1946, an ancient, false rumor called the blood libel starts spreading through the city of Kiel. This is the insane accusation that Jews murder non-Jews for their rituals. And it was enough to ignite a mob of civilians, police, and soldiers who then attacked a building that was housing Jewish Holocaust survivors. 42. That's the number. 42 Jewish survivors were murdered that day. These were people who had somehow made it through the concentration camps, only to be killed by their neighbors more than a year after the war ended. The impact of this was just devastating. Beyond the dead and the more than 40 who were injured, it sent a chilling message. It proved that this hatred wasn't just some imported Nazi idea. It was embedded deep in parts of the society itself. And the result? A mass exodus. Jewish survivors realized they just weren't safe, even with Hitler gone.
Which brings us to a really obvious but huge question. If this was so widespread, how on earth was it kept quiet for so long? Why did it take until 2001 for the story of just one town, Jedwabne, to come to light? Well, the answer really comes down to the official story versus what actually happened. After the war, the new communist government in Poland, which was backed by the Soviets, created a very specific narrative. And that narrative was one of pure victimhood. In this story, every single war crime was committed by the Germans, period. And that official story was used to just completely erase the reality of Polish collaboration. And this wasn't just them forgetting to mention it. No, this was an active, systematic cover-up. If you were a witness and you tried to speak out, you'd be threatened, maybe worse. The crimes were officially denied or just brushed off as unimportant. All the blame was pushed onto the Nazis because, let's be honest, it was politically useful. It helped build this new national identity of a country that had only suffered with no skeletons in its own closet. So you might be thinking, okay, that was a long time ago, but this isn't just history. This fight over how to remember the past is happening right now in Poland. It's a huge deal, causing massive political fights and really intense debates. And all this tension, it boiled over just a few years ago. In 2018, the government, clinging to that old narrative of pure victimhood, did something that, well, it got the world's attention. They passed a law. It got nicknamed the Holocaust Law around the world. And it basically made it illegal, a criminal offense, to even suggest that the Polish nation had anything to do with Nazi crimes. Now, they walked it back a bit after huge international backlash, but the message they sent was loud and clear. Do not talk about this. And this isn't just political posturing. It has had very real, very scary consequences for the people actually doing the research. Historians like Jan Grabowski, they've been targeted with huge smear campaigns. They've gotten death threats. People have demanded they be fired from their university jobs. And for what? For publishing history based on evidence. So you see, what's happening here isn't just some dusty debate between academics. It is a deep, painful struggle for the soul of a nation. It's a country trying to figure out how to deal with the ugliest parts of its own past. And it's all happening right now, out in the open. And you know what? This impulse to just bury the past, it wasn't just a Polish thing. Not by a long shot. After the war, this silence fell all across Europe. It was like a collective decision to just move on instead of facing what had happened. You gotta remember, after the war, in a lot of Western Europe, the big focus was just rebuilding, getting the economy back on track, putting cities back together. The absolute priority was national recovery, not some painful soul-searching about who did what during the war. It was like an unspoken agreement to look forward, not back. And the story of one man, the Italian Jewish survivor Primo Levi, just perfectly captures this whole mindset. His name is world famous now, but believe me, it wasn't always that way.
He poured his experience into a book that would become one of the most powerful and essential memoirs of the Holocaust ever written, called If This Is a Man.
But here's the kicker. In the years right after the war, nobody would publish it. No publisher would touch it. Just think about that for a second. The desire to forget was so powerful that one of the most important eyewitness accounts of the 20th century was turned away. People just weren't ready to hear it. So why does all this matter now? Because this isn't just dusty old history. This legacy of collaboration and, maybe more importantly, the failure to really confront it, casts a very long shadow that is still lingering over Europe today. Just look at this number, 500,000. What is that? Well, that's how many Croatian nationalists showed up recently for a concert by a well-known pro-Nazi singer. It was a world record-breaking crowd. It's a massive, stark symbol of a refusal to acknowledge a criminal past. And these kinds of echoes of a criminal past, they're all over the place. In Spain, there's what some call an imposed silence, kept in place by the heirs of old fascist criminals. We just saw that staggering concert in Croatia. These aren't just random events. They are symptoms of a history that was never truly dealt with. And all of this forgetting, this denial, It feeds directly into a really worrying trend we're seeing right now across Europe, the steady increase in votes for far-right parties, many of which are the direct political descendants of the fascists and Nazis of the past.
So it all comes down to this one final question for us to think about, a question this entire history forces us to ask. When a society makes a choice, consciously or not, to bury the darkest parts of its past, what exactly is it risking for its future?